My name is Ren Castellano. I'm 26 years old, and I live in Savannah, Georgia, in a historic townhouse on a shaded street lined with live oaks, dripping Spanish moss. A house that had belonged to my family for 3 generations, its wrought iron balconies and worn brick facade a source of considerable pride for my parents, who treated the building itself almost like another member of the family, one whose reputation had to be protected as carefully as our own. But this story doesn't begin in that beautiful old house on a normal morning. It begins on a Saturday in early April with the sound I will never forget for the rest of my life. The distinct, metallic click of a deadbolt turning from the outside of my own bedroom door. I woke up that morning to sunlight filtering through the gauzy curtains my mother had chosen for my room years earlier, back when I was still a teenager and had no say in decorating my own space, and for a moment everything felt entirely ordinary. I stretched, reached for my phone on the nightstand, and noticed it was already past 9, later than I usually slept. I swung my legs out of bed, padded across the room in my bare feet, and reached for the doorknob to head downstairs for coffee. The knob turned in my hand, but the door didn't open. I remember the specific, disorienting confusion of that moment, the assumption, my first instinct, that something must simply be jammed, that the old door had swollen slightly with the humidity the way old Savannah houses so often did. I pushed harder, rattled the knob, pressed my shoulder against the frame. Nothing. It was only when I crouched down and peered through the narrow gap between the door and frame that I saw it, a keyed deadbolt, brand new, gleaming brass against the door's old white paint, installed sometime while I slept, on the outside of my own bedroom door. I want you to understand, whoever is listening to this, that my entire body went cold in that moment. A specific, visceral fear I had never experienced before, not even close. I was 26 years old. I had my own job, my own car, my own bank account, and somehow, overnight, while I slept, my family had transformed my childhood bedroom into something functionally indistinguishable from a cell. "Mom?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly with a panic I was trying, unsuccessfully, to suppress. "Mom, the door won't open. Something's wrong with the lock." I heard footsteps in the hallway outside, slow and deliberate, footsteps I recognized immediately as my mother's, a woman who never rushed anywhere, who moved through the world with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who had never once doubted her own authority within these walls. "Nothing's wrong with the lock, Ren. It's working exactly the way it's supposed to." My mother's voice came through the door, calm, almost gentle, which somehow made everything infinitely worse. "Your father and I talked it over with Nolan this week. We think it's best if you stay home for a little while, sweetheart, just until you've had time to really think clearly about your choices, without outside influences clouding your judgment." Outside influences. I knew exactly who she meant, and something hot and furious began rising in my chest, burning through the first fog of panic and confusion. "You mean Gabriel?" "We're not going to discuss this through a door, Ren. I'll bring you breakfast in a little while." I heard her footsteps retreating down the hallway, unhurried, as if she'd simply informed me of a minor scheduling change, rather than announcing that I was, in every meaningful sense of the word, a prisoner in my own family's home. I sat down heavily on the edge of my bed, my mind racing through the events of the past several months, trying to trace the exact trajectory that had led to this moment, a moment that felt so absurd, so impossible, that some detached part of my brain kept insisting this must be some kind of elaborate misunderstanding that would resolve itself within the hour. It didn't resolve itself within the hour, or within the day. My mother did bring me breakfast as promised, unlocking the door just long enough to set a tray on my desk, eggs, toast, a small glass of orange juice arranged with the same careful attention she'd have given any ordinary meal, as if the domestic normalcy of the gesture could somehow offset the fact that she was quite literally keeping her own daughter under lock and key. She wouldn't meet my eyes directly as she set the tray down, and when I tried to push past her into the hallway, my brother Nolan appeared behind her in the doorway, arms crossed, blocking my path with his considerable size, an expression on his face that I can only describe as grimly satisfied, as though he'd been waiting for exactly this opportunity to demonstrate his authority over me. "This is for your own good, Wren," Nolan said, his voice carrying the particular condescension he'd perfected over years of positioning himself as the family's self-appointed enforcer, the older brother who had long ago decided it was his responsibility to correct what he perceived as my repeated lapses in judgment. "You'll thank us eventually." "You cannot lock me in my own bedroom, Nolan. This is illegal. This is literally a crime." "It's our house," he said simply, as if that single fact settled the matter entirely, as if property ownership somehow granted my family unlimited authority over my body and my choices. "You're welcome to leave anytime you want to actually listen to what we're telling you. But as long as you keep sneaking around behind our backs with that boy, we're not going to just stand by and watch you ruin your life." The door closed again after that, the deadbolt clicking into place with a finality that made my stomach lurch. I sat alone in my room for the rest of that morning, staring at my phone, my hands trembling slightly, as the reality of my situation continued to sink in more deeply with each passing minute. I thought about calling the police, my thumb hovering over the emergency dial button for a long, agonizing moment before a specific, complicated fear stopped me. Not fear of my family exactly, but fear of what it would mean to involve law enforcement in what still felt, despite everything, like a family matter. Fear of the messy, public unraveling that would follow. Fear of how it might affect my father's law practice, my mother's standing in the tight-knit social circles of old Savannah families that had known each other for generations. I had spent 26 years being taught implicitly and explicitly that family conflicts stayed within family walls, that airing our problems publicly was its own kind of betrayal, and even in that moment of genuine crisis, some deeply conditioned part of me hesitated to break that unspoken rule. Instead, I did something that felt, in the moment, both smaller and somehow more urgent. I texted my best friend, Yolanda Briggs, my hands shaking as I typed. "Wren, they locked my bedroom door from the outside, installed an actual deadbolt. I'm not joking. I'm literally locked in my room right now." Yolanda's response came almost immediately. "What? Are you serious right now? That's insane, Wren. That's actually illegal. That's unlawful confinement or something. Do you want me to call someone?" "I don't know. I don't know what to do. I think this is about Gabriel. They found out we're still seeing each other." "I'm calling Gabriel right now. He needs to know what's happening." I remember sitting there on my bed after sending that message, staring at the locked door that separated me from the rest of my own house, and felt a strange, disorienting mixture of humiliation and rage that I didn't fully know how to process. Humiliation, because some part of me, despite everything, despite being a fully grown adult with my own career and my own life, still felt a childish shame at having been caught, at having disappointed my family so thoroughly that they'd resorted to something this extreme. And rage, a slow building, clarifying rage, at the sheer audacity of what they'd done, at the casual, matter-of-fact way my mother had described installing a lock on my door as though she were describing a minor home improvement project rather than an act that stripped away every ounce of autonomy I'd spent my adult life building. I thought about Gabriel, about the specific quality of tenderness in his voice whenever he spoke to me, about the 2 years we'd spent building a relationship my family had never once given a genuine chance, dismissing him from the very first introduction based on nothing more than his family's more modest circumstances and a set of prejudices they'd never bothered to examine or question.
My phone buzzed again, this time not from Yolanda, but Gabriel directly, and my heart lurched with a complicated mixture of relief and fresh anxiety as I read his message. Yolanda just told me what's happening. I can't believe this. I'm coming over right now, Ren. I don't care what your family says. I'm not going to just sit here knowing you're locked in that house. I stared at that message for a long moment, feeling something crack open in my chest. A fear, immediate and visceral, of what might happen when Gabriel arrived at my family's front door, of how my father and Nolan might react to his presence, of the confrontation that seemed to be barreling towards all of us, with a momentum I no longer had the power to stop or slow. Please be careful. I don't know what they'll do. My dad has never liked you, and Nolan is even worse. I don't want this to turn into something worse than it already is. Gabriel, I love you, Ren. I've loved you for 2 years, and I'm not going to let your family keep treating you like you're 17 years old and incapable of deciding who you want to be with. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I set my phone down on the bed beside me, my hands still trembling, staring at the locked door that separated me from the rest of my own house, and felt for the first time since waking up to that terrible metallic click, something other than pure panic beginning to take shape underneath the fear. Because whatever was about to happen when Gabriel arrived at my family's front door, I understood, with a clarity that felt almost startling in its suddenness, that this exact, absurd, humiliating moment of being locked away like a misbehaving child was going to be the last time my family got to make that particular kind of decision for me. I had no idea, sitting there on the edge of my childhood bed with the morning sun slanting through gauzy curtains I'd never chosen for myself, exactly what Gabriel was planning to bring when he arrived. I only knew that 20 minutes felt like an eternity, and that somewhere beneath my fear, a small, steady flame of something that felt almost like hope had begun, quietly, to burn.
To understand how I ended up locked behind a deadbolt in my own childhood bedroom, you need to understand how Gabriel Ferreira and I met, and more importantly, you need to understand exactly why my family decided, almost from the very first mention of his name, that he represented an unacceptable threat to whatever future they had quietly, meticulously planned for me since before I was even old enough to have opinions of my own. I met Gabriel a little over 2 years ago at a farmer's market that set up every Saturday morning along the riverfront, a market I'd started frequenting after moving into my own apartment downtown, enjoying the specific, simple pleasure of buying fresh vegetables and local honey without my mother hovering nearby offering opinions on my selections. Gabriel worked at his family's small produce stand, helping his mother Elena manage the modest but well-loved business she'd built over nearly 2 decades, selling tomatoes and peaches and colored greens grown on a small piece of land his family had farmed for 3 generations, in a very different sense of generational property than the one my own family liked to invoke about our historic townhouse. I remember the specific moment I first noticed him, not some dramatic, cinematic instant, but something quieter, more ordinary, the way he patiently helped an elderly customer count out exact change, the genuine warmth in his voice as he asked about her garden, the easy, unforced kindness that seemed to define every interaction I watched him have that morning while I lingered near his family's stand, pretending to examine tomatoes I had no particular need for. "You've been standing there for almost 10 minutes, he said, a small, knowing smile playing at his mouth as he finally addressed me directly. "Either you're planning the most elaborate salad of your life, or you're trying to work up the courage to ask me something." I laughed, embarrassed at being caught so plainly, and something about that easy, unguarded exchange set the tone for everything that followed. We talked for nearly an hour that morning, well past any reasonable pretense of tomato shopping, and I learned that he'd studied civil engineering at Georgia Southern, that he'd chosen to come back to Savannah after graduation, specifically to help his mother keep the family farm running after his father's death 3 years earlier, that he worked a full-time engineering job during the week and still found time every Saturday to help run the produce stand that had been his family's livelihood for decades.
I didn't tell my family about Gabriel for nearly 2 months after we started dating, partly because our relationship was still new and uncertain, but partly, if I'm honest with myself even now, because some instinctive part of me already sensed how they would react, sensed that I was somehow protecting something fragile and precious by keeping it away from their scrutiny for as long as I reasonably could. When I finally did introduce him at what I'd hoped would be a low-key family dinner, the reaction was immediate and unmistakable, even beneath the thin veneer of politeness my parents maintained throughout the evening itself. My father, Desmond Castellano, a successful attorney who had built his own practice over 30 years and held very particular, rigid ideas about what constituted an appropriate match for his only daughter, spent most of dinner asking Gabriel a series of pointed questions about his career trajectory, his family's finances, his long-term plans, questions delivered with the polite but unmistakable condescension of a man conducting a job interview for a position he'd already decided the candidate wasn't qualified for. "So you're still helping your mother with the produce stand?" my father asked at one point, his tone carrying just enough emphasis on the phrase to make its dismissiveness unmistakable, despite the technically neutral wording. "Yes, sir, most Saturdays," Gabriel replied, his composure entirely unshaken, a steadiness I found myself admiring, even as I felt my own stomach tightening with anxiety about how the rest of the evening might unfold. I remembered the specific, loaded silence that followed his answer, my mother's polite smile not quite reaching her eyes, my brother's barely concealed smirk from across the table, a silent commentary on what he clearly considered an inadequate answer to an implicitly loaded question. After Gabriel left that evening, my father didn't waste any time expressing his actual assessment. "He seems like a perfectly nice young man, Ren, genuinely," he said in the specific tone I'd learned over the years to recognize as a preamble to devastating criticism disguised as reasonable concern. "But you have to think practically about your future. What kind of life can he realistically offer you? Running a fruit stand and working some entry-level engineering job? That's not the kind of stability someone with your education and background should be settling for." "He's not settling, Dad, and neither am I. He has a genuine engineering career, and helping his mother doesn't diminish that. Why does his family's business matter so much to you?" "It's not about the business specifically, sweetheart," my mother interjected, her voice carrying that particular gentleness she deployed whenever she was about to say something genuinely hurtful, as if softness of tone could somehow neutralize the cruelty of content. "It's about compatibility, about shared backgrounds, shared expectations. Marriages work best when both families come from similar circumstances, when there aren't these fundamental gaps in how people were raised, in what they value."
I understood, even in that first conversation, exactly what she was actually saying beneath the careful, diplomatic language, that Gabriel's family didn't have money, didn't have the kind of old Savannah social standing my own family had spent generations cultivating, and that this fact alone, regardless of his character, his work ethic, his genuine kindness, disqualified him entirely in my parents' calculations. My brother Nolan was considerably less diplomatic about his own objections. 3 years older than me, Nolan had spent most of our adult lives positioning himself as the family's designated protector of standards, a self-appointed role that seemed to give him enormous satisfaction, allowing him to exercise a kind of authority over my choices that he'd never once earned through any particular wisdom or insight of his own. "You could do so much better than some guy selling vegetables on weekends," he told me bluntly about a month after that first dinner, cornering me in the kitchen of our parents' house during a Sunday visit. "I'm not trying to be harsh, Ren, but you need someone who thinks about the future practically. What happens when you want kids, want a real house, want the kind of life you grew up with? You think a farm stand is going to pay for any of that?" "You've spent maybe 2 hours total in his presence, Nolan. You don't actually know anything about him or what he's capable of." "I know enough. I know his family doesn't have connections, doesn't have money, doesn't have the kind of background that opens doors for you down the line. That matters whether you want to admit it or not."
I want to be honest about something here, because it's important to the fuller shape of this story. My family's objections were never really about Gabriel as an individual person, about his actual character or his genuine capacity to build a good life alongside me. They were about class, about a rigid, deeply held belief system that measured a person's worth almost entirely by their family's financial standing and social connections. A belief system I had absorbed uncritically for most of my childhood, before slowly, gradually coming to recognize how hollow and cruel it actually was. Over the following 2 years, my relationship with Gabriel continued despite my family's persistent, escalating disapproval, though I'd learned, unfortunately, to compartmentalize the relationship, keeping it carefully separate from most family gatherings, minimizing conversations about him whenever possible, a kind of quiet accommodation that I recognize now with the clarity of hindsight as its own form of slow surrender, a gradual erosion of my own autonomy that I'd allowed to happen incrementally, telling myself each small compromise was simply practical rather than a genuine capitulation. My grandmother Constance, my father's mother, was the notable exception to the family's unified disapproval, a fact I didn't fully understand or appreciate until much later, when I learned the deeper history that explained her quiet, persistent kindness toward Gabriel from the very first time she met him. "She has good hands," she told me once, unexpectedly, during a visit I'd made to her small cottage on the edge of town, watching Gabriel help fix a broken fence post during a rare occasion when he'd accompanied me. "Hands that know real work. Don't let your father and brother convince you that's something to be ashamed of, Ren. Some of the finest people I've ever known had exactly those kinds of hands." I didn't fully understand in that moment the specific weight behind her words, the personal history she was quietly alluding to without yet explaining it directly. That understanding would come later, during the darkest days of my confinement, when Constance would reveal a story from her own youth that would reshape everything I thought I understood about my family's rigid expectations, and would prove instrumental in helping me survive the escalating crisis that was even then quietly building toward the moment my family would finally cross a line from mere disapproval into something far more serious, far more indefensible. The escalation that eventually led to my confinement didn't happen suddenly. It built gradually over several months, each incident slightly more intense than the last, until the cumulative weight of my family's mounting pressure finally erupted into the crisis that would define the worst weekend of my adult life. It started in earnest at my cousin's wedding in late January, an event that brought together most of my extended family, including several relatives I saw only rarely, among them Reverend Silas Hartwell, a family friend and pastor at the church my family had attended for 3 generations, a man my parents had apparently decided, without ever explicitly discussing it with me, would serve as an unofficial matchmaker for what they considered a more suitable partner. That suitable partner, it turned out, was Bradley Ashworth, the son of one of my father's closest professional colleagues, a young attorney himself from a family with exactly the kind of old-money Savannah pedigree my parents valued above almost anything else. I'd met Bradley a handful of times over the years at various family and social functions, and while he was perfectly pleasant in a bland, unremarkable way, I'd never felt anything beyond polite acquaintance toward him. My mother seated me directly beside Bradley at the wedding reception, a placement I recognized immediately as deliberate rather than coincidental, and spent much of the evening steering conversation in ways clearly designed to highlight our supposed compatibility. Similar educational backgrounds, overlapping social circles, families who had known each other for decades. "Bradley's just made partner at his father's firm," my mother mentioned at one point, with the specific brightness she reserved for information she considered particularly significant. "Isn't that wonderful? Such a bright future ahead of him." "That's great for him," I replied, keeping my tone carefully neutral, aware of exactly what game was being played, but unwilling to create a scene at my cousin's wedding. Reverend Hartwell approached me later that same evening during a lull in the reception, settling into the seat beside me with the particular gravity he brought to conversations he considered pastorally significant. "Your parents mentioned some complications in your romantic life, Wren," he said, his voice carrying the kind of gentle, presumptuous concern that always made my skin crawl slightly, the sense of a man who believed his position entitled him to weigh in on matters that were, quite simply, none of his business. "I want you to know I've counseled many young couples over the years, and I've seen firsthand how important it is to choose a partner whose values and background align closely with your own. It's not about snobbery, dear. It's about setting a marriage up for genuine, lasting success. With respect, Reverend, I think I'm capable of evaluating my own relationship without outside guidance." Of course, he said, in a tone that made clear he didn't actually believe this at all. "I only mention it because your parents are genuinely worried about you, Wren. They love you very much, and they simply want to see you build the kind of stable, prosperous future you deserve." I left that wedding reception feeling exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour, a specific, accumulated weariness from spending an entire evening fending off carefully orchestrated pressure disguised as casual social conversation. The formal intervention, when it finally came, arrived about 6 weeks later on a Sunday afternoon I'd been invited to for what I understood, based on my mother's phrasing, to be an ordinary family dinner. I arrived to find not just my parents and Nolan present, but Reverend Hartwell as well, seated in our formal living room with an expression of practiced solemnity that made my stomach immediately drop with the recognition that this was not, in fact, going to be an ordinary Sunday dinner. "Wren, sweetheart, please sit down," my mother said, gesturing toward the armchair positioned, I noticed, with a specific dread, directly facing the small semicircle they'd arranged themselves in, an arrangement that felt uncomfortably like the staging for exactly the kind of confrontation I'd apparently walked into unprepared.
"What's going on? Why is Reverend Hartwell here?" My father began, his voice carrying the particular gravity he usually reserved for closing arguments, "about the direction your life has been heading, and about some choices we think need serious reconsideration." What followed was nearly 2 hours of coordinated pressure, each family member taking turns articulating variations on the same fundamental argument, that my relationship with Gabriel represented a serious lapse in judgment, that continuing to pursue it would jeopardize my future happiness and stability, that a relationship with someone like Bradley Ashworth would offer everything Gabriel supposedly couldn't. "We've arranged for you to have dinner with Bradley next Friday," my mother announced at one point, as though this were a reasonable, collaborative decision, rather than something being imposed on me entirely without my consent. "Just to give him a genuine chance, sweetheart. That's all we're asking." "I'm not interested in Bradley, Mom. I'm in a committed relationship with Gabriel, and I have been for 2 years. This isn't a phase, and it's not going to change no matter how many dinners you arrange." "Wren," my father's voice carried a warning edge I recognized from childhood, the specific tone that had once made me instantly compliant, but that now, as an adult, simply made something harden in my chest instead. "We have given this relationship 2 years of patience, hoping you'd come to your senses on your own. That patience has clearly not produced the outcome we hoped for." Because there's nothing wrong with my relationship that needs to be come to my senses about. Gabriel is a genuinely good person. He works hard, he's kind, he takes care of his family. The only actual problem here is that his family doesn't have as much money as you'd like, and I refuse to end a relationship I love because of something as shallow as that. Reverend Hartwell interjected at this point, his voice carrying practiced pastoral calm. "Wren, I understand this feels deeply personal, and it is, but sometimes the people who love us most can see clearly what we, blinded by immediate emotion, cannot yet recognize ourselves. With respect, Reverend, I think I understand my own feelings better than anyone else in this room." The conversation deteriorated from there, tensions rising steadily until Nolan, apparently frustrated by what he perceived as my continued unreasonable stubbornness, finally said the words that would set everything else in motion. "Maybe if she can't be trusted to make good decisions on her own, we need to start making them for her, at least until she's thinking clearly again."
I remember laughing, actually laughing, at the sheer absurdity of that statement, before realizing with a growing dread that nobody else in the room appeared to find it absurd at all. "You're not serious," I said, looking between my parents' faces, searching for some sign that this was simply Nolan's characteristic overreach rather than an actual family consensus. "You're not serious." My father's silence in that moment told me everything I needed to know. I left that afternoon deeply shaken, though I still couldn't quite believe, even then, that the vague threat implicit in Nolan's words would actually materialize into anything concrete. I called Gabriel that evening, recounting the entire confrontation, and I remember the specific tightness in his voice as he listened. "Ren, I don't like this. This doesn't sound like normal family disagreement anymore. This sounds like something more serious." "I know. I don't know what to do, though. It's still my family, Gabriel. I don't want to just cut them off completely over this." "I'm not asking you to cut them off. I'm asking you to be careful. Please just be careful." 3 weeks later, I woke up to the sound of a deadbolt clicking into place on the outside of my own bedroom door, and understood with a clarity that felt almost like a relief after weeks of uncertain dread, exactly how serious my family had actually been. I spent the better part of that Saturday morning pacing the confines of my locked bedroom, checking my phone obsessively for updates from Gabriel, my mind cycling through increasingly frantic scenarios about what might happen when he arrived. It was nearly 11 o'clock, almost an hour past the 20 minutes he'd promised, when I heard a soft, deliberate knock at my door, different from my mother's earlier knock, quieter, more careful. "Ren, it's Grandma Constance. Open the door a crack if you can, dear." "I can't, Grandma. It's locked from the outside. Someone installed an actual deadbolt." There was a pause, and then I heard her voice again, tighter now, carrying an edge of genuine anger I'd rarely heard from my grandmother in all my years of knowing her as a woman of unshakable, gracious composure. "They did what?" "They locked me in, Grandma, Mom and Dad and Nolan, because of Gabriel." I heard her exhale slowly on the other side of the door, a long, controlled breath that seemed to be working to contain something considerable. "Give me a moment, sweetheart. I need to speak with your father." What followed was nearly 20 minutes of muffled but clearly heated conversation somewhere downstairs, voices rising and falling in a rhythm I couldn't fully decipher through the thick old walls of the house, though I could tell, even through the muffling distance, that my grandmother's voice carried a fury I'd genuinely never witnessed from her before. When she returned to my door, her voice had regained its careful calm, though something underneath it still trembled with barely suppressed anger. "Your father won't give me the key, Ren. Says this is his household to manage and I should stay out of it. I want you to know I told him exactly what I think of that decision, and it was not gentle." "Grandma, I don't understand why this is happening. Why does everyone care so much about who I love?" There was a long pause before she answered, and when she did, her voice carried a weight and vulnerability I'd never heard from her before, the sound of someone finally choosing to share something she'd carried privately for a very long time. "Because your father learned this behavior somewhere, Ren, and I'm ashamed to admit that somewhere was from his own father, and from me in a way I've regretted every single day since." She paused again, and I pressed myself closer to the door, straining to hear every word. "When I was 22 years old, I was in love with a man named Elijah Prather. He worked at the shipyard, came from a family with very little money, very little social standing in this town. My parents forbade the relationship entirely, told me in no uncertain terms that a Castellano-adjacent family, I was engaged to your grandfather's older brother at the time, if you can believe that particular complication, did not marry shipyard workers. Grandma, I had no idea." "Nobody does, dear. It's not a story I've told many people, and certainly not one your father has ever heard, not fully. My parents didn't lock me in a bedroom, but they did something perhaps equally effective. They simply refused to let me leave the house unaccompanied for nearly 4 months, always making sure someone was present to prevent me from seeing Elijah, wearing me down slowly with 1,000 small restrictions until I finally, exhausted and isolated, gave up and agreed to marry your grandfather's brother instead, a man I never once loved the way I loved Elijah. If I'd only had the courage at 22 to defy my family the way you're trying to defy yours now. I sat down heavily against the door, my back pressed to the wood, feeling the full weight of what she was telling me settle over me with a specific, aching sadness. I'm so sorry, Grandma. Don't be sorry for me, sweetheart. Be smarter than I was. I spent decades wondering what my life might have looked like if I'd simply had the courage to walk out that door when I had the chance, instead of slowly, quietly allowing my family to wear down my resistance until I no longer had the strength to fight them. I will not watch that same thing happen to my own granddaughter, not if there's anything at all I can do to prevent it. What can you do, Grandma? You said Dad won't give you the key. No, but I still have my own resources, dear, and your grandfather, God rest him, taught me a great deal about being resourceful during our marriage. Give me some time, and in the meantime, keep your phone charged and keep talking to that young man of yours. From everything I've seen of him, he strikes me as considerably more resourceful and considerably more brave than my own family ever gave Elijah credit for being. Over the following hour, my grandmother became my lifeline to the outside world in ways both practical and profoundly emotional. She brought me a phone charger, slipping it under the door with a small notepad and pen, explaining in hushed tones that she wanted me to document everything happening, every conversation, every detail, in case, she said carefully, this ends up mattering more than your parents currently realize.
She also, in a move that struck me as almost impossibly clever given the circumstances, managed to locate a spare key to my bedroom door, not the new deadbolt, which apparently only had 2 keys, both currently held by my father and Nolan, but the original doorknob lock beneath it, which, as it turned out, could still be operated from outside using an old skeleton key she'd kept from decades earlier, when the house's original locks had all used a uniform key system before various modernizations over the years. This won't undo the deadbolt, she explained quietly through the door, but it means I can at least get in to check on you properly, bring you real meals, use the bathroom without your mother hovering over the whole process like you're some kind of criminal being escorted to the yard. Through this narrow but crucial channel of support, I learned over the following hours that Yolanda had indeed reached Gabriel immediately, and that he was, according to my grandmother's careful reconnaissance downstairs, currently sitting in his car just down the street, apparently waiting for something before actually approaching the house directly, a detail that filled me with a confusing mixture of relief and fresh anxiety, uncertain what exactly he might be waiting for. He's not alone in that car either, my grandmother reported, peering through the gap in my curtains from outside my locked door, having apparently found a vantage point from a hallway window. There's another car parked just behind his, a woman getting out of it now. Looks like it might be his mother, if my memory of meeting her briefly a while back serves me correctly. Elena's with him? Why would he bring his mother into this? I couldn't tell you, dear, but from where I'm standing, it looks like they're waiting for someone else to arrive before making their move. Whatever Gabriel is planning, it doesn't look like something he decided on impulse. I felt something steady and clarifying settle over me at that information, a specific grounding calm that helped push back against the frantic uncertainty I'd been marinating in for hours. Gabriel had never been an impulsive person in the 2 years I'd known him. I'd learned every significant decision he made, a habit his engineering background had only reinforced. If he was waiting for something before approaching my family's front door, it meant he had a plan, a specific strategy rather than simply an emotional rush towards confrontation.
My grandmother left briefly to prepare lunch, promising to return with real food rather than whatever thin justification my mother might offer. And in the relative quiet of her absence, I found myself thinking again about her story, about Elijah Prather and the life she might have lived if she'd found the courage at 22 to simply walk away from a family determined to control her choices. I thought about how close I had come over the preceding 2 years to allowing exactly that same slow erosion to happen to my own resolve, the small compromises, the careful compartmentalization of my relationship with Gabriel, the gradual accommodation of my family's disapproval that I had told myself was simply pragmatic patience rather than what it actually was, a slow, incremental surrender of my own autonomy, precisely the kind of surrender that cost my grandmother decades of quiet, private grief. I pulled out the notepad she'd given me and began writing, documenting everything, the exact time I'd discovered the locked door, my mother's precise words when she'd explained the situation, Nolan's blunt admission that they intended to control my choices until she's thinking clearly again, Reverend Hartwell's presumptuous involvement, the entire trajectory of escalating pressure that had led to this moment. I didn't yet know exactly how this documentation would matter, but something in my grandmother's careful instruction, in case this ends up mattering more than your parents currently realize, told me it was important, that whatever was about to happen when Gabriel finally approached that front door, having a clear, contemporaneous record of everything that had transpired, would prove significant. My grandmother returned about 40 minutes later with a proper lunch, a plate piled generously with fried chicken and collard greens, clearly prepared with far more care than the earlier tray my mother had brought, along with news that made my heart leap with a fresh surge of anticipation. "There's a third car now," she reported, settling into the small chair just outside my door that she'd apparently claimed as her post for the duration of this crisis. A woman getting out, professional-looking, carrying what appears to be a briefcase. And Wren, dear, I recognize her, or at least I recognize the type. She has the specific bearing of an attorney, the kind of confident walk that comes from years spent in courtrooms. A lawyer? Gabriel brought a lawyer? It would appear so, yes. And your father is currently pacing in his study downstairs, dear, looking considerably less confident than he did this morning when he first explained his little household improvement project to me. I felt something shift inside my chest at that news, a rising, cautious hope that had been almost entirely absent from the long, frightening hours since I'd first discovered that locked deadbolt. Whatever Gabriel was planning, whatever careful, methodical strategy had led him to arrive, not with impulsive confrontation, but with legal representation, it meant that my family's confident assumption of complete control over this situation was already, even before any direct confrontation had occurred, beginning to crack.
The doorbell rang at exactly 12:47 in the afternoon. I remember the precise time because I glanced at my phone the instant I heard the sound, some instinctive part of me already understanding that this moment would matter enough to remember with exact precision. I heard my father's footsteps moving toward the front door, unhurried but carrying a tension I could detect even through the muffling distance of my locked room, and then the sound of the door opening followed by voices, Gabriel's voice, calm and clear, saying something I couldn't fully make out from my position, followed by a second unfamiliar voice, a woman's voice, with the crisp, professional cadence my grandmother had already predicted. "Mr. Castellano, my name is Priscilla Doyle. I'm an attorney. This is Gabriel Ferreira, and this is his mother, Elena Ferreira. We're here regarding your daughter, Wren Castellano, and I want to be direct with you about why we're here before this conversation goes any further." My father's response was too quiet for me to make out clearly, but I could hear the specific tightness in his voice even through the distance, the sound of a man who had just realized, with dawning alarm, that the situation he'd assumed he controlled entirely was rapidly slipping beyond his grasp. "I need you to understand something clearly, Mr. Castellano," Priscilla Doyle continued, her voice carrying the specific, measured authority of someone who had delivered similarly difficult conversations many times before.
I received a phone call this morning from Gabriel, who explained that your adult daughter has been confined against her will inside this residence, with a lock installed specifically to prevent her from leaving. I want to be very clear that what you have described, and what Gabriel has described to me, constitutes unlawful imprisonment under Georgia law. This is not a gray area, and it is not a family matter that falls outside of the scope of legal intervention. Confining a competent adult against her will, regardless of the relationship between the parties involved, is a criminal offense. I strained to hear my father's response, catching fragments, something about just wanting to protect her, something about our house, our rules, the same justifications he'd offered through my locked door hours earlier, though his voice now carried a noticeably diminished confidence. With respect, Mr. Castellano, property ownership does not grant you the legal authority to confine another adult against her will, regardless of your relationship to her or the deed to this house, Priscilla replied, her voice unwavering. I would strongly encourage you to unlock your daughter's door immediately before this situation escalates into something with far more serious legal consequences than I suspect you've fully considered. I heard my mother's voice enter the conversation at this point, higher, more agitated than my father's controlled tension. You don't understand our family. You don't understand the situation. Wren has been making terrible decisions, and we're simply trying to help her see clearly before— Mrs. Castellano, Priscilla interrupted, her voice still calm but noticeably firmer. I understand you may genuinely believe you're acting in your daughter's best interest. Many people who commit this particular offense believe exactly that. But intention doesn't change the legal reality of what's occurred here. I have, sitting in my car outside, a formal statement I'm prepared to file with local law enforcement documenting unlawful confinement, along with a witness statement from your neighbor, Mr. Bramwell, who observed the deadbolt installation yesterday afternoon and has confirmed, when I spoke with him this morning, that he witnessed Wren's car remaining in the driveway without any sign of her leaving the property since that installation. I felt a jolt of surprise at the mention of Mr. Bramwell, our elderly neighbor who had lived 3 doors down for as long as I could remember, a quiet, observant man who, apparently unbeknownst to my family, had been paying considerably more attention to our household's activities than anyone had realized. This is absurd, Nolan's voice cut in, sharp and defensive. We're not criminals. We're a family trying to protect our sister from making a huge mistake. Mr. Castellano, Priscilla continued, apparently addressing Nolan now, I'd advise you to think very carefully about continuing to speak in ways that could be construed as admissions of intent in what is quickly becoming a documented legal matter. Right now, you have an opportunity to resolve this situation before it requires formal police involvement. I would strongly encourage your family to take that opportunity. There was a long, tense silence following this statement, one that stretched on long enough that I began to wonder, with mounting anxiety, whether my family might actually choose confrontation over compliance, might genuinely be prepared to escalate this situation into the kind of formal legal crisis Priscilla was describing.
It was Gabriel's voice that broke the silence, quieter than the previous exchanges, but carrying an unmistakable steadiness. Mr. and Mrs. Castellano, I know you don't think highly of me, and I understand, at least partly, why. You're worried about Wren's future, about her stability and happiness, even if I think you're going about protecting those things in exactly the wrong way. But whatever you think of me personally, whatever concerns you have about my family's finances or background, none of that gives you the right to lock her in a room like she's a child who can't be trusted with her own decisions. She's a grown woman. She has her own career, her own home, her own life that she's built successfully without needing anyone's permission. The fact that she chooses to spend that life with me isn't a crisis that requires this kind of extreme intervention. It's just her exercising the same basic autonomy every adult deserves. I heard my grandmother's voice enter the conversation at this point, and something in her tone, steady, resolute, carrying decades of quiet regret finally finding its voice, made my chest tighten with emotion. Desmond,
she said, addressing my father directly, using his first name with a specific gravity I recognized from childhood as the tone she reserved for moments of genuine seriousness. I want you to think very carefully about what you're doing here today, because I have seen this exact scenario play out before, and I promise you, it does not end the way you're hoping it will. Mother, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time, Desmond. Decades ago, my own parents did something similar to me. Not this extreme, not a literal lock and key, but similar in spirit, similar in the underlying belief that they knew better than I did about my own heart and my own future. They wore me down, slowly over months, until I finally gave up a man I genuinely loved and married someone else instead, someone my family approved of, someone whose family had the right kind of money and the right kind of name. I have regretted that decision every single day for the past 50 years, Desmond, and I will not stand by silently and watch you do the exact same thing to your own daughter, using tactics considerably more extreme than the ones used against me. I heard my father's sharp intake of breath, the specific sound of someone genuinely surprised by information they'd never previously known. You never told me any of this. No, I never did, because I was ashamed of my own weakness, ashamed that I hadn't found the courage to fight for what I actually wanted at 22 years old. But I'm telling you now, in front of everyone here, because I refuse to let that same shame and regret become Ren's inheritance simply because you've convinced yourself that money and social standing matter more than her actual happiness. The silence that followed this revelation stretched on for what felt like several minutes, though it was probably closer to 30 seconds, before my father finally spoke again, his voice noticeably shaken in a way I had genuinely never heard from him before in my entire life. "Give me the key, Nolan," he said quietly. "Dad, we can't just—" "Give me the key, now." I heard footsteps moving up the stairs, multiple sets, and then finally, after nearly 6 hours of confinement, the specific sound I had been waiting for with an intensity I couldn't fully articulate, the metallic click of the deadbolt turning, followed by my bedroom door swinging open to reveal my father standing in the doorway, his face pale, his expression carrying an emotion I couldn't fully identify, somewhere between shame and genuine dawning realization of what he actually done. Behind him, in the hallway, I could see Gabriel, Elena, Priscilla Doyle, my mother, Nolan, and my grandmother, all standing in a loose semicircle, the entire assembled cast of this crisis finally converging in one shared space after hours of separation through a locked door. "Ren," my father said quietly, his voice carrying none of its earlier authority, "I need you to know that I never intended for this to feel like a crime, Dad," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, carrying the accumulated weight of the past 6 hours of fear and helplessness finally finding release. I watched my father's face crumple slightly under the weight of that statement, and for the first time in the entire crisis, I felt something shift in the fundamental power dynamic that had governed my entire relationship with my family for as long as I could remember. The recognition, finally fully realized, that I no longer had to accept their authority over my choices simply because they were my parents, simply because I had spent 26 years being conditioned to believe their approval was a prerequisite for my own happiness.
I want to take a moment here to explain more fully exactly what Gabriel had spent those anxious hours arranging while I sat locked in my bedroom, because the careful, methodical response he'd taken taught me something important about the specific kind of love he'd been offering me for 2 years. Not a love built on grand, impulsive gestures, but one built on steady, deliberate preparation, the same quality that had first drawn to him at that farmer's market stand. When Yolanda called him that morning with news of my confinement, Gabriel told me later, sitting together in my apartment several days after everything had settled,
His first instinct had indeed been to drive directly to my house, to pound on the door and demand my immediate release through sheer force of confrontation. But something had stopped him. A specific memory, he explained, of a conversation his mother Elena had once had with him years earlier, after a cousin of his had gotten into a heated dispute with an ex-girlfriend's family that had escalated into a physical altercation, resulting in an arrest that had followed his cousin for years afterward, complicating job applications and background checks long after the actual incident had been resolved. My mom always told me, Gabriel explained, that anger feels powerful in the moment, but it rarely actually solves anything. If you want to actually fix a problem, especially one this serious, you need to think clearly, not just react emotionally, no matter how justified that emotional reaction might be. So instead of driving directly to my house, Gabriel had first called his mother, explaining the situation in full, and Elena, drawing on her own decades of hard-won practical wisdom running a small business through countless legal and regulatory complications, had immediately suggested contacting a lawyer before doing anything else. "I know Priscilla Doyle," Elena told me, when we'd all had a chance to sit down together in calmer circumstances. "She helped us years ago when a supplier tried to breach a contract with our farm, back when Gabriel's father was still alive. She's sharp, and more importantly, she doesn't back down when she believes something wrong has actually occurred." "What you're describing," Priscilla told him during that initial meeting, according to Gabriel's later account, "isn't simply a family dispute that happens to feel dramatic. If everything you're telling me is accurate, this constitutes false imprisonment under Georgia law, a serious offense regardless of the family relationship involved. I want you to understand, before we proceed, that we have real legal leverage here, leverage considerably more powerful than simply showing up and demanding they open the door." Priscilla had suggested, before approaching the house directly, gathering as much corroborating evidence as possible, which led Gabriel and Elena to make a brief detour to speak with Mr. Otis Bramwell, our elderly neighbor, whose property afforded a clear view of our driveway and front entrance. "That old man doesn't miss much," Gabriel told me, with a small, appreciative laugh. "He told us he'd noticed a hardware delivery truck at your house Friday afternoon, and then noticed your car hadn't moved from the driveway since Saturday morning, which he found usual, since he said you always left for your Saturday run around 8 in the morning. When I explained what we suspected was happening, he didn't hesitate for a second before agreeing to provide a formal statement. Said something about how he'd watched enough families in this neighborhood over 60 years to recognize when something wasn't right, and he wasn't going to just look the other way because it was easier." This corroborating testimony, combined with the physical evidence of a demonstrably new lock installed specifically to confine an adult resident, gave Priscilla exactly the foundation she needed to approach my family with genuine legal authority, rather than simply moral appeal. "I want to be honest about something," Priscilla told me during that same later conversation when everyone had gathered to fully process what had happened. "If your family hadn't opened that door when they did, I was fully prepared to call local police directly and file a formal report. False imprisonment is a serious enough charge that law enforcement would have responded quickly, and your father, given his own legal background and professional reputation, would have faced consequences considerably more severe than simply an uncomfortable confrontation in his own living room." I asked Gabriel during that same conversation why he'd chosen this particular approach rather than simply confronting my family directly and demanding they let me out through sheer force of will or emotional appeal. "Because I know your family, Ren, or at least I know enough about them after 2 years to understand that emotional appeals were never going to work on people who'd already convinced themselves they were acting in your best interest," he said. Your father is a lawyer. He respects legal authority, respects consequences, respects the kind of pressure that comes from someone who can actually hold him accountable in a way that matters. I could have shown up alone, furious, demanding they let you out, and honestly, I think there's a real chance that approach would have made things worse, would have given your brother an excuse to escalate physically, would have turned this into exactly the kind of chaotic confrontation that rarely resolves anything cleanly. I wanted to bring something they couldn't simply dismiss or argue their way around. I thought about that explanation for a long time afterward, about the specific wisdom embedded in Gabriel's calm, methodical response, and I understood, with a clarity that deepened my love for him considerably beyond what it had already been, that this was precisely the quality my family had never bothered to genuinely evaluate when they dismissed him as an unsuitable match based purely on his family's financial circumstances. A genuine, steady wisdom about how to actually solve difficult problems, a capacity for clear thinking under pressure that had nothing to do with his bank account or his family's social connections. Elena Ferreira, too, had brought something crucial to that confrontation beyond simply moral support for her son. A specific, hard-won credibility that came from her own decades of navigating difficult situations as a small business owner, a woman who had raised her family and built a modest but genuinely respected local business entirely through her own resourcefulness after her husband's unexpected death. "I told your father something before Priscilla arrived," Elena mentioned to me later with a small, knowing smile. "I've told him that I've watched my son grow into a man of real character over the past several years, watched him take on responsibilities most young men his age never have to consider, watched him balance a demanding engineering career with helping keep his family's legacy alive after his father passed. I told him that whatever assumptions he'd made about our family based on our modest circumstances, he'd fundamentally misjudged the actual measure of a person's worth." I asked her what my father had said in response to that. "Nothing, really," she said, but I could see something shift in his expression. I don't think anyone had ever actually challenged his assumptions quite that directly before, at least from someone he'd have to acknowledge had genuinely earned the right to speak with that kind of authority. What struck me most, reflecting on everything that unfolded that Saturday afternoon, was how thoroughly Gabriel's calm, methodical approach had dismantled my family's entire framework of justification. They had constructed an elaborate story over the preceding months about protecting me from a poor decision, about exercising legitimate parental concern for my future stability and happiness. But faced with an attorney calmly explaining the specific legal consequences of their actions, faced with a neighbor's independent corroboration, faced with Gabriel's composed, unwavering resolve rather than the emotional, easily dismissed outburst they'd perhaps expected and prepared themselves to weather, that entire justification structure had collapsed almost immediately, revealing the actual, indefensible reality underneath. They had committed a genuine crime against their own daughter, motivated by prejudices about class and social standing that had nothing to do with legitimate concern for my well-being.
After my father unlocked that door, after the deadbolt finally clicked open and I stepped for the first time in 6 hours back into the hallway of my own family's house, what followed wasn't the immediate, clean resolution I might have hoped for, but rather a difficult, extended conversation that stretched on for nearly 2 more hours, moving eventually from the hallway down into the living room, where everyone, my parents, Nolan, my grandmother, Gabriel, Elena, and Priscilla, settled into an uneasy semicircle to finally address everything that had led to this crisis. "I want to understand something," I said once we'd all settled, my voice steadier than I expected given the emotional exhaustion of the preceding hours. "I want to understand exactly what you thought was going to happen, Dad. Did you actually believe that locking me in my room would change how I felt about Gabriel? Did you think I'd just come around eventually and thank you for it?" My father was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness I had genuinely never heard from him before.
I don't know what I thought, Ren, honestly. I think I convinced myself that if I just removed the influence for long enough, you'd have space to think clearly about your actual future without the immediate pull of infatuation clouding your judgment. Infatuation. Dad, we've been together for 2 years. That's not infatuation. That's a genuine, committed relationship. And the fact that you can't even bring yourself to call it that after everything that's happened today tells me you still don't actually understand what you did wrong here. What I did wrong, my father repeated, his voice tightening, is apparently break the law according to your lawyer here. I understand that much. That's not what I'm asking about, and you know it. I'm asking whether you understand that you tried to control my life because you've decided, without ever actually getting to know Gabriel as a person, that his family's financial circumstances disqualify him from deserving my love. That's what actually happened here, Dad. Not some abstract legal violation. A specific, personal betrayal of trust built on prejudices you've never once bothered to examine. My mother spoke up at this point, her voice carrying a defensiveness that had softened only slightly from her earlier certainty. We were trying to protect you, Ren. Is that so hard to understand? We've watched you build a wonderful career, a genuinely impressive life, and we were terrified of watching you throw that away on what, Mom? Finish that sentence. On someone who doesn't come from money? On someone whose family runs a produce stand instead of a law firm? Say the actual thing you mean instead of hiding behind vague language about protection. My mother's face flushed, and for the first time in the entire confrontation, I watched something like genuine shame cross her features, rather than simply defensive justification. I suppose that is what I mean, at least partly. I've always believed that shared background matters, that couples who come from similar circumstances have an easier path forward together. Grandma didn't come from a similar background to Grandpa's brother, the man her family forced her to marry instead of the man she actually loved, I said, watching my mother's eyes widen with surprise at this information, clearly hearing the story of Elijah Prather for the first time. And according to what Grandma told me today, that shared background didn't produce a happy marriage. It produced decades of quiet regret. So maybe the whole theory you've built your entire approach around isn't actually as sound as you've always assumed.
My grandmother, who had remained relatively quiet throughout most of this exchange, finally spoke again, her voice carrying the specific authority of someone who had earned, through decades of hard experience, the right to be heard on exactly the subject. Fiona, Desmond, I need you both to understand something clearly. I have spent 50 years watching this family repeat a pattern that caused me enormous private pain, a pattern of believing that love should be evaluated primarily through the lens of financial and social compatibility rather than genuine character and commitment. I stayed silent about my own experience for decades because I was ashamed, because I didn't want to burden anyone with old regrets. But I will not stay silent while you inflict that same pattern on Ren, especially not through means as extreme and genuinely illegal as what you did today. Nolan, who had been notably quiet since the door was unlocked, finally spoke, his voice carrying less of his earlier bravado and more of what sounded like genuine, if reluctant, reconsideration. I still think you're making a mistake, Ren. I still think you could do better than someone who's going to spend his career running a farm stand and doing mid-level engineering work. But I'll admit, I didn't think through what we actually did today. I got caught up in feeling like I needed to protect you, and I didn't stop to think about whether locking you in a room was actually protection or just control dressed up as concern. It wasn't a full apology, not the complete acknowledgement I might have hoped for, but it was, from Nolan specifically, a more significant admission than I had expected, and I found myself unexpectedly moved by even that partial recognition.
Gabriel had remained largely quiet throughout this family confrontation, understanding, I think, that this particular reckoning needed to happen primarily between me and my family rather than centering his own presence in the room. But near the end of that difficult conversation, he finally spoke directly to my parents, his voice carrying the same calm steadiness that had characterized his entire approach to this crisis. "I want you to know something," he said. "I don't need your approval to love Ren, and I'm not going to spend my life trying to prove myself worthy of standards that I think are fundamentally unfair to begin with. But I do want you to know that I take her happiness and her future seriously, that I've built a stable career, that I'm committed to building a genuinely good life alongside her, regardless of whether that life includes your blessing or not. I'd prefer to have a relationship with you both, for Ren's sake, because I know how much her family means to her, despite everything that's happened today. But that relationship, going forward, has to be built on actual respect for her choices, not on tolerance conditioned on her eventually giving up on the life she's actually chosen for herself." My father was quiet for a long moment after Gabriel finished speaking, and when he finally responded, his voice carried an exhaustion that seemed to extend well beyond the events of that single difficult day. "I don't know how to undo what we did today, Ren. I don't know how to fully explain the thinking that led us here, beyond simply admitting it was wrong, deeply wrong, in ways I'm only beginning to fully understand." "You don't have to undo it, Dad. You just have to actually change going forward. That's what would matter to me. Not some performative apology, but genuine, demonstrated respect for my choices starting today." The conversation didn't resolve into some neat, complete reconciliation that afternoon. There was too much raw hurt, too much genuinely serious wrongdoing to process for everything to simply smooth over within a single difficult conversation. But something fundamental had shifted, a crack finally appearing in the rigid framework my family had constructed around love and worthiness, a framework that had governed my entire understanding of my place within this family for 26 years. I left my parents' house that evening with Gabriel, choosing to stay temporarily at my own apartment rather than remaining under a roof where I no longer felt entirely safe, though I did embrace my grandmother for a long moment before leaving, feeling a specific, profound gratitude for the courage it had taken her to finally share a story she'd carried privately for 50 years, a courage that had proven instrumental in finally breaking through my father's rigid certainty. "Thank you, Grandma, for everything today," I whispered. "Don't thank me yet, sweetheart," she said, holding my face gently in her weathered hands. "The real work is just beginning, for your family to actually earn back your trust, and for you to build the life you actually deserve, without needing anyone's permission to do it."
It has been 8 months now since that terrible Saturday when I woke up to the sound of a deadbolt clicking shut on my own bedroom door. And I want to tell you honestly that the path forward from that day wasn't simple or immediate, but it has gradually led somewhere genuinely good. Gabriel and I moved in together 3 months after that confrontation, into a small but comfortable house not far from the farmer's market where we'd first met. A house we chose together, deliberately, as a space that belonged entirely to us rather than carrying the weight of anyone else's expectations or approval. We're planning to marry next spring, a wedding that will be modest by my family's usual standards, but that will be entirely, genuinely ours, built around the people who have actually shown up for us, rather than the social calculations my mother once believed mattered most. My relationship with my parents has followed a slower, more complicated trajectory than my relationship with Gabriel, one that required considerably more time and considerably more difficult conversations to even begin rebuilding. Priscilla Doyle, in the immediate aftermath of that confrontation, advised me that I had every legal right to pursue formal charges against my family for what they'd done, and I want to be honest that I considered it seriously for several weeks, weighing the genuine seriousness of what had happened against my complicated, enduring love for my parents despite everything.
Ultimately, I chose not to pursue formal charges, though I made clear to my family that this choice reflected my own values around forgiveness and family reconciliation, rather than any diminishment of how seriously I regarded what they'd done. My father, to his genuine credit, has spent these 8 months demonstrating a sustained, consistent effort toward actual change, rather than simply offering the kind of performative apology I'd initially feared, attending several sessions with a family therapist, making a genuine effort to get to know Gabriel as an individual person rather than simply evaluating him through the narrow lens of his family's finances, even attending a Saturday morning at the farmer's market a few months ago, spending nearly an hour talking with Gabriel and Alina at their produce stand in a conversation that Gabriel later described to me as a surprisingly genuine. My mother's progress has been slower, more halting, though I've noticed small, meaningful shifts. A birthday card sent to Gabriel on his birthday last month, a genuine question asked about our wedding planning rather than the pointed comparisons to more socially prominent weddings she might once have made. I don't know if my mother will ever fully abandon the class-based assumptions that shaped so much of her worldview for so many decades, but I've come to accept that meaningful change, for some people, happens slowly and imperfectly rather than through some sudden, complete transformation. Nolan and I have rebuilt a cautious but genuine friendship, one that required him to fully acknowledge, in a conversation we had several months after the initial crisis, the specific harm of his role as the family's self-appointed enforcer. "I think I convinced myself that controlling you was the same thing as caring about you," he told me during that difficult but ultimately healing conversation. "I'm sorry it took something this extreme for me to actually recognize the difference." My grandmother, Constance, has become an even more central figure in my life since that crisis. Our relationship deepened by the vulnerability she showed in finally sharing her own story of Elijah Prather. She attends dinner with Gabriel and me at least twice a month now, and I've watched her in these months since seem to carry herself with a lightness I hadn't fully noticed was missing before, as though finally speaking her long-held secret had lifted a weight she'd carried silently for 50 years. "I think about Elijah sometimes, even now," she told me recently, over dinner at our new house. "I wonder what became of him, whether he found happiness eventually with someone else. But I find, strangely, that watching you build the life I never had the courage to build for myself has given me a kind of peace I didn't expect to find at this stage of my life. You did what I couldn't, Ren. You walked through that door instead of letting them lock you away from what you actually wanted."
I think often in quiet moments about that specific image, the locked door, the deadbolt clicking shut, the 6 hours I spent trapped in my own childhood bedroom while my family debated my future as though I were still a child incapable of determining my own path. And I think about what it eventually took to open that door again. Not just Gabriel's careful, methodical courage, not just Priscilla Doyle's legal expertise, not just Mr. Bramwell's quiet, observant witness, but my grandmother's 50 years of accumulated regret finally finding its voice at exactly the moment it needed to matter most. If there's a lesson I've carried forward from that terrible, transformative day, it's this: love that requires you to shrink yourself, to accept confinement, whether that confinement comes as a literal locked door or as the countless smaller, quieter restrictions we sometimes accept from people who claim to love us, was never actually love in the first place. It was control, dressed up in more comfortable language. You do not need anyone's permission to choose who deserves your heart. And sometimes the very people who claim to be protecting you from making a terrible mistake are the ones who need, more urgently than you do, to learn what genuine love and respect for another person's autonomy actually looks like. The door that once locked me away from the life I wanted has long since been removed, replaced with an ordinary door and an ordinary lock, one I control entirely myself now. But more importantly, the door between me and my family, while it required considerable work, considerable difficult honesty, and considerable time to reopen, has proven, unlike what I feared in the darkest hours of that terrible Saturday, to open both ways after all.